Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, a new independent monthly podcast focused on geopolitical risk to serve decision makers working in specialty insurance markets and beyond. I'm your host, David Benyon. Today we're going to talk about the reconstruction of Ukraine, and I'm joined by Jake Hernandez, CEO of crisis and intelligence consulting business AnotherDay, a Gallagher company. We'll discuss the efforts underway in the insurance markets to find coverage solutions to underwrite the rebuilding of Ukraine. We'll talk about some of the barriers, the risks in Ukraine itself at present, and how Jake's been working to overcome them, including recent visits to Kyiv itself. Jake, welcome to the pod.
Thank you.
So firstly, how often are you in Kyiv?
So I've been there a few times since the start of the war, but I've actually been working in Ukraine since 2015, which, as you know, 2014 was the first Russian invasion, and what we're actually dealing with now is the second. My experience is there. It's been complicated, I guess, is the way that I would describe it. To have a front row seat to what Ukrainians are going through and to what the country's going through, it's difficult and it's quite hard to describe. So, I think the Ukrainian government have done an amazing job at trying to explain overseas what's happening in the country and what the Russians are doing to Ukraine. But I think seeing it up close and personal is something very, very different. For example, we hear a lot about air raids going on in Kyiv. I think what's probably less well publicized is that, to give you an example, every Ukrainian has an air raid app on their phone, so they know when an air raid is occurring. And a lot of it is actually psychological warfare. So it's not necessarily just the missiles or the drones or whatever else it is. It's effectively someone setting an alarm for you 4 times a night that you don't control, that kind of goes off very, very loudly. So you can imagine the psychological impact of that when you're dealing with, the elderly, with kids, dealing with this thing going off 4 or 5 times a night. So I think it's really, really hard to describe just how much the war has affected Ukraine.
When the sirens go off or the app gives you a warning, do you have much warning, and does it tell you where to go and find the nearest shelter?
Yeah, it does. So the government have been really good at mapping out where shelters are. But so effectively the way that it tends to work is the app itself is connected to the air defense network. So the Ukrainian air defense will spot when the Russians launch jets in Belarus or where they're launching jets over the Black Sea. And they'll try and give you as much notice as possible. And what they actually also do is they kind of live tweet what's happening at the time. So for some of the larger air raids, you have the air defense basically saying, look, you have about 40 minutes. We see the missiles entering this particular oblast, like this district. It's flying over this region. So, the Ukrainian government have done an amazing job at trying to bring along the population. But again, I think the problem is that Ukrainians have been dealing with this now for over a year. And, it's every single day. It's completely relentless. There was a recent American Chamber of Commerce survey that basically identified that 32% of Ukrainian companies have actually had someone killed during the course of the war since February. And so, the war kind of permeates every single aspect of Ukrainian society. And I think that's really difficult for us to understand, just watching the news.
With regard to your own trips to Ukraine, what would you describe your goal as?
So the goal for us has been to try to understand the insurability of war risk, number one, and whether that can be risk managed, number two. So obviously I come from a risk management background. I don't come from an insurance background. The reason why we think that's really important is, and we are absolutely not the only people doing that. There are plenty of actors in the insurance world that have been doing a lot of amazing work. But the main reason that we're trying to do that is it's a really significant barrier to future investment. And it also is creating a drag on the Ukrainian economy because it's impossible to transfer that war risk at the moment. And so the economy isn't functioning in an efficient way. And if we can figure out a way of doing that, then that could really improve the prospects for Ukraine's economy if the war starts to drag on.
In reference to what you were saying about roughly a third of Ukrainian businesses have suffered someone killed who worked for that business, and you were talking about the situation in Kyiv itself, Ukraine's a big country. From personal knowledge, I know if you're in Kyiv in the northeast of Ukraine, you're actually still in artillery range from the Russians. So I'm guessing that the risk is dramatically different depending where you are in the country. Lviv, for example, is in the far west. It's a supply hub for Western supplies and aid and munitions and things, but it's hundreds of miles from the front line. Is that variation something that you look at?
The variation, I think, is actually the only reason why war risk might be insurable and risk manageable in Ukraine. And that you're absolutely right, that that's something that we need to try and understand to build something that's workable. So to your point, Kharkiv Oblast was in fact, it was the first oblast, like district, that was invaded by the Russian army on the morning of February 24th. It created unbelievable amounts of destruction just in Kharkiv. Whereas, like you said, if you go to somewhere like Uzhgorod, which is on the border with Slovakia, you wouldn't believe that you're in Ukraine. And so those differences are really stark. And I think for the sort of specialty insurance market, the perception of the risk, I think at the moment is very, very different to the actual risk in many cases. So I think in some ways people are kind of drawing back to examples like Iraq and Afghanistan, where you had this sort of residual level of risk that was permeating the entire country.
In those conflicts, it was a nationwide insurgency.
Exactly right. Yeah. So I think that perception is incorrect when you apply it to the Ukraine context, but it's just what everyone kind of reaches back to.
I know you're not an insurance person, you're a risk management background person, but from a market perspective, something like an exclusion, I mean, there is a marine war exclusion, the RUB that covers Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, would just be blanket because it's Ukraine. It doesn't take any account of the fact that it's an enormous country.
And that's exactly the problem that we need to solve collectively. The main thing that we are trying to do now is to understand what data would be needed to present that dynamic into the specialty insurance market. And there's a few different types of data. So clearly one is incident data emanating from the war, but that incident data doesn't necessarily apply itself immediately to potential loss data from an insurance perspective. So that's one obstacle that needs to be gotten over. The other thing is that it's very hard to change the perception of the war, the perception of the risk environment in Ukraine with just data. So it's also understanding, what opportunities might there be for people to go to parts of Ukraine to understand it in a more detailed way so that they can start to absorb what might be possible from a war insurance perspective to try and prop up the Ukrainian economy.
Can you talk a little bit about the entities that you meet over there? If not naming names, but the types of entities, whether you're meeting government, private sector, or a combination?
It's a combination, really, all of the above. So there's kind of two things that we do. The first is speaking to, entities in the Ukrainian insurance markets. That might be brokers and underwriters. From another perspective, it's also about information collection. So on that side of the house, it could be speaking to government, it could be speaking to local security companies, it could be speaking to law enforcement, the state emergency service, and just understanding what's going on the ground. Because what we tend to find is when we do these kinds of trips, what's actually happening there is very, very different from what we might have expected or the way that it's presented on some of the sort of rolling 24-hour news networks. I think for me, that's been the biggest lesson for Ukraine is we exist in a world which kind of relies on 24-hour rolling news cycles. So take, for example, the recent counteroffensive. We're all kind of expecting that there'll be significant progress very, very quickly. But this is a war that kind of defies that 24-hour rolling news cycle because it has very long tracks of activity, tracks of very little activity at all. And so trying to understand and reflect that when we're thinking about risk can be pretty difficult.
So, Jake, it's almost a year since Gallagher's acquisition of AnotherDay, your business, and that's become part of Gallagher's London-based specialty operations, or becoming part of it. There's a definite trend going on within specialty insurance companies in the market more generally, I would say, brokers and carriers, to partner with or to acquire crisis management consultancies or special risk services firms. And that's been everything from kidnap and ransom and piracy through to cyber risks in recent years. So to my mind, it fits that kind of trend pattern. Firstly, I'm interested whether you agree with that as someone who's actually involved at the sharp end of one of those acquisitions. And if you could just give us an overview of what AnotherDay does and how that fits into the strategy of a broker.
What we effectively do is we manage risk when it is concerned with what we call malicious intent. So a bad actor there somewhere. So you can extrapolate that out to, war, exactly what we're talking about right now, terrorism, cyber, crime, all of those kinds of things. And I think you are 100% right that it's definitely part of a trend. When we were having the M&A discussions with Gallagher, they were very forward looking and the conversation was basically around, we need to start to play a much more active role with clients, not only in how they transfer risk into the market, but also how they manage that risk in the first instance. And the thing that we kept coming back to was clients who are sitting in senior leadership teams at kind of C-suite level, who are watching the news and seeing images of things that they never thought would have been possible 10, 15 years ago. And it dawning on C-suites that these things are a reality and the world is becoming more, not necessarily unstable, but definitely more volatile. So, Gallagher Specialty wants to have something to say to clients around that and wants to have a way to work with them to manage those kinds of risks. And that's exactly what we do.
That's sort of the raison d'etre for this entire podcast, in that I think since the invasion of Ukraine in particular, the world has become more volatile, or at least markets have woken up to it, as indeed most of us have in society. But I'm interested, so which specialty lines do you work most closely with at the broker?
At the moment, it's terrorism, political violence, cyber, D&O. I think what we are definitely spending a lot more time on now is working with marine work. We've done a huge amount of work with aerospace. Clearly Russia, Ukraine had a really significant impact on that market. To try to understand, how do we connect? What are the areas from an insurance perspective, a risk transfer perspective, where a risk manager can come in and play a really significant role? And I think that's still evolving, and we'll find more areas where that becomes relevant. I don't think we are expecting to necessarily be getting involved at this level on Ukraine, but it's great, it's fantastic. And I think that's activity that we would not have been able to undertake if we weren't acquired by Gallagher.
The only line that I wasn't really expecting you to say there was D&O. And that's not one of the lines that I usually associate with this podcast at all. So how does that relate to the work that you do?
D&O is a really interesting area because it's a bit of a catch-all, it's a bit of an umbrella. And what I mean by that is it's around how senior leadership take decisions around all of those other areas of risk. So from their perspective, from a senior leadership perspective, if we're talking to a client about geopolitics, we're not just talking to them about what the risk that poses to their organization. When you talk about D&O, you're also talking about how the decisions they make around those risks can themselves precipitate losses. So the cyber is a really interesting example of that, where we've seen a lot of D&O cases recently around class action lawsuits alleging that a company has mishandled a cyber breach, has not released it out publicly into the market, they haven't disclosed it correctly. And so that's a really important area of our consulting with clients to say, look, it's not just the external risk, it's also about how you handle it. That can create some issues for the organization as well.
There were a lot of market announcements just in the past week. The Ukraine Recovery Conference took place in late June, and UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak welcomed G7 finance ministers, World Bank representatives to London. And that conference resulted in a number of public-private commitments to help Ukraine rebuild from the destruction caused by the invasion, raised around 60 billion or more towards recovery and reconstruction. There was also some announcements in insurance markets at the same time as that event was taking place. There was a proposal of a war risk pool and a partnership announced at Lloyd's, for example. So there's certainly a lot going on in this space in the insurance market. Do you think risk transfer in rebuilding Ukraine is something for now, or does it have to wait until after the war?
There's two audiences for risk transfer in Ukraine, I think. The first is Ukrainians and Ukrainian companies. And then the second is international companies who would be looking to enter and invest in Ukraine after the war. If you ask those two audiences what they want, the answers are different. And so that's something that we've been trying to bottom out. If you ask a Ukrainian audience, what is the most important period in which we can ensure war risk? They will say, without a pause, that it's right now. There's no point having war risk facilities that only operate after the war has ended. So we need to try to figure out how we do that. And that's a really significant challenge. In terms of the international audience, I think they are more thinking about, even when the war ends, even if there's some kind of agreement in the future.
Yeah, I mean, they're thinking about a kind of Marshall Plan type approach to this, but that requires the guns to have fallen silent at that point.
Exactly. But even at that point, they would be a little bit nervous about going into Ukraine without having war risk insurance, because clearly the world is quite volatile and we can never quite guarantee what another actor is going to do. So I think bridging the gap between those two audiences is what I think everyone's trying to do right now, to say, okay, well, and actually to me, one feeds into the other. So in the long term, war risk insurability in Ukraine is going to be focused on property and business interruption. I don't think it's possible to do that at the scale that's needed without generating data from more specific areas that we have to do right now. So say, for example, inland transit is one example of that, where it's insurable now, we can generate some data and then try and use that data to make much larger portfolios like property insurable in the future. So I think it all kind of connects together.
You've been working on some of the barriers to reconstruction and breaking those down. So I'll ask the question in two parts. What are some of the greatest barriers that you see on the ground in Ukraine from the actual risk side of the problem?
The first one, and we've touched on it previously, is perception in some ways. I think the perception of the conflict is such that people effectively say that the risk begins as soon as you cross the border into Ukraine. I think from a pure risk, operational risk perspective, to me, the biggest issue is still around airstrikes, really, predominantly. So that's one of those things that's very, very hard to predict. We've seen Russian targeting patterns change quite a lot over the winter. It was absolutely focused on energy infrastructure. Now, over the summer, that's moving more towards command and control. Because the thing is, when you talk about the front line, we see pictures on the news of places like Bakhmut, which is where there's been a lot of conflict over the last 8 to 9 months. You can sort of operate outside of, you mentioned artillery range, outside of the range of artillery. But what's very difficult to do is to understand what Russian targeting patterns are around things like airstrikes.
The airstrikes on Kyiv have been cruise missiles or repurposed missiles that are designed to anti-air, but because they're running out of cruise missiles, if the stories are true, then that they've had to expand their stocks by using some of those. But there's a limited amount. So we're not talking about lobbing shells constantly. It's not quite nightly, but regularly.
To give you an example, and this is an example that someone in Ukraine gave me, the Russians have been using anti-ship missiles against, effectively targets inside cities. And what happens is that the guidance system of the missile is designed to look for the largest thing in front of it. Because, of course, if it's flying over the water, the big thing in front of it is probably the ship that it's trying to hit. If you extrapolate that out to an urban environment, though, what tends to happen is it's looking for a target. If there's a large civilian block of flats next to it, it thinks that's the target because it's looking for a ship and hits the civilian block of flats instead. It's those kinds of dynamics that it's really difficult to try to get to the bottom of. And I think, like you said, the quality of old Soviet, in inverted commas, precision-guided weaponry means that even if they're launching it at a target, it's probably not going to hit that target. It's going to hit something else.
We see tragic stories almost every day about a residential block or a retail business that is on the receiving end of one of those missile strikes. The initial reaction is always that it's a human tragedy, that we see innocent civilians and children being killed by these attacks. So in a way, though, obviously war is a terribly cruel thing, but it seems so random, especially from a risk perspective, because these weapons are not as precision as they might be, that it's hard to know whether a factory or a shopping mall or whatever the risk might be could end up on the receiving end, because the missile might land anywhere within miles of the target it's aiming for, right?
This is why the Ukrainian government, since the start of the war, did something very sensible and said that, shopping malls, they're now closed in Ukraine and will be closed for the duration of the war. Any large gatherings like concerts, again, banned, will be until the final day of the war for exactly that reason. When we're talking about the management of the risk and the insurability of the risk, this is why data is so important, because we need to understand, is it possible to assess, to extrapolate where it's more likely to have a missile strike or drone strike compared to somewhere else? Because only once we do that will we understand exactly how insurable the risk in Ukraine is, which, as we've been saying, is really critical to creating an environment in which reconstruction can take place.
What probably most people in the West don't even really consider is that this is more or less getting towards a societal effort, towards something close to total war, or for the Ukrainian side, perhaps not the Russians, because they can still have to maintain perceptions of business as usual. But when the Ukrainians have mobilized their entire society for this, is there just a general blurring of the line between civilian and military anyway?
No, I wouldn't go that far. I think you're right in that the whole of society has been mobilized. So to give you an example of that, if you're sitting on the train from Kyiv, back to Poland, there's kind of screens on the train that show various advertisements and news articles and various things. I would say probably about 40 to 50% of those items that you see on the screens are somehow related to the war. One of them is an advertisement by the Ukrainian government trying to get people to be more accepting of people with prosthetic limbs, because Ukrainian society after the war is going to have a lot of people who have legs, arms that are prosthetic. And so creating an environment in which those people feel accepted by the rest of society is really, really important. It's all of those kinds of things that you don't consider. That having been said, though, when you consider this distinction between civilian and military, in Ukraine, everywhere you go, there are people in military fatigues, as you can imagine, when you mobilize the whole of society. Ukraine absolutely is not trying to hide its armed forces. They are operating very, very openly. And so I think when Russia claims that they're going after a particular target, which is a military target in an urban area, it's very disingenuous, because there's plenty of military targets that they could have gone for. It's just they chose one in a civilian area. So it's really difficult to tread that line. But I think you're right that it's hard for people in the West to understand just how much society has been mobilized.
Does it matter from an insurer's perspective, or should it matter? Because on the one hand, some of these tragic missile attacks that may well hit a mall or a retail target, a shop, whatever it might be, they seem awfully random. But at the same time, if half of the economy is geared towards economic activity that supports the war effort, does it matter from an insurance perspective whether you're insuring a risk that is 100% civilian in nature, or it's a company contracted to something that does support the war effort?
It's definitely a criteria that you would have to look at, absolutely, because it wouldn't necessarily affect insurability as such, but it would absolutely affect the level of risk that an insurer might be willing to accept in regards to what you're trying to insure, right?
You mentioned energy earlier on. I know that the Russian strategic bombing campaign, for what it is, has moved on from that. But certainly energy infrastructure would have been very difficult to have this conversation with that.
Exactly right. And so that's why intelligence is so important, and understanding what the intelligence is telling you. So to give you an example, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, people have been watching with quite some interest. There is real concern in Ukraine that the Russians will carry out some kind of provocation involving the power plant, to the point where the Ukrainian government has actually released models of how radiation might spread if it was released from the plant. So you have to use intelligence in a forward-looking way to understand how the conduct of the war might change, which would therefore affect what might be insurable and not, and what those risk criteria are.
And when you talk to people on the insurance side of the equation, so when you're flying back to London and you're talking to London market, obviously your colleagues, brokers and carriers too in the market, what are some of the barriers that you hear from their side rather than in Ukraine itself?
Clearly with the caveat that I don't have an insurance background, but the reinsurance exclusions, meaning that anything written in Ukraine would have to be written on a net line basis, really limits the amount that the market can do, I think, right now. So everyone that I speak to is very, very keen. And I know, for example, Lloyd's have been working very hard to try and create options and to try and create support for Ukraine. But the reality is that insurers are private companies with shareholders, and there is only so much risk that they're willing to take. The stopgap to that, and I think this is where donor governments are becoming very aware of this, is that in the short term, it's probably going to be government donor money from outside Ukraine that creates that insurance capacity. And then at least it creates the opportunity down the line for my colleagues here to broker risks, or the underwriting markets to write things, understanding what that lost data looks like, which has been backed up by governments.
I understand for OPSEC reasons you can't talk about when you've been over there recently and when you're going back in the future. But tell us a little bit for a moment about the journey, the difficulties of getting to and from Kyiv at the moment.
The journey's pretty mammoth. And actually, to be fair, it's one of the things that has really limited the Ukrainian economy, is the ability for people to go there. So the journey involves trains. So the Ukrainian train service is called Ukrzaliznytsia. The work that they have been doing is absolutely incredible. The trains have been running since the very start of the war. They've moved about 6 million refugees out of Ukraine. Joe Biden used the train to get from Poland to Kyiv. The fact that they've kept the network running is just a gargantuan task. So
Southern trains could learn much from the
They
Ukrainian.
definitely could. They definitely could. So yeah, the trip to get from Kyiv to London is probably a 26-hour journey. About 12 hours of that would be on a train. But again, without that train network functioning, Ukraine would have been in a very, very difficult place. It's absolutely created this amazing lifeline all the way across the country. And it all comes into a couple of small towns in Poland, that I've never heard of personally before, but now have become these kind of centers of geopolitical kind of intrigue and interest, because that's where the trains go. And so, yeah, the journey can be quite difficult. So hopefully, again, one of the things that will really improve the prospects of the Ukrainian economy is when the war ends, the ability to fly into Kyiv again, to fly into Lviv again. That's really going to generate a lot of activity, I think.
I'd like to thank Jake for sharing his experiences about the important work he's doing in Ukraine. Insurance is a business, but it can also be a noble calling. I took a couple of key points from the conversation. First, that perceptions of risk can be very different depending on your perspective. A risk being placed by a broker in the London market can look different to the same risk when viewed close up, even in a place like Ukraine. War risk wordings or exclusions, for instance, can be wielded like a blunt instrument. Physical assets in places like Kyiv, Kharkiv, or Lviv oblasts are separated by hundreds of miles from each other and face very different probabilities of getting hit in this conflict, the focus of which has already shifted several times in the last 16 months and counting. The work that Jake does helps to unfog the lens between the picture out there in Ukraine and the market's view of insurance perils viewed from the comfort of the City of London or elsewhere. Secondly, I took from that rebuilding Ukraine has to be a project for the present, not just for the future after the war has ended. Economic activity goes on despite the war in Ukraine, and insurance is necessary for the taking of risk and to underwrite development. To enable that to happen while the bombs are still falling requires careful negotiation, such as Jake's work in Ukraine, and also progress such as that made in London in June, with announcements from the likes of Marsh & McLennan, Aon and Lloyds. Clearly there's going to be a lot more work to come, and there's going to be an important role for public-private partnerships between the insurance sector and government. Much of this reconstruction and economic development work will inevitably come later, once Ukraine's ports and airports reopen and something more like normal trade can resume. How that all unfolds is still subject to the conduct of the war itself. Stay safe, Jake, and thank you for tuning in. You've been listening to the Political Risk Podcast, hosted by me, David Benyon. My guest was Jake Hernandez, production by Peter McGill, and music by Lawrence Durkin. Do join me next time when we'll be talking about Taiwan.